Growing up in the late 80s, early 90s, I remember knowledge was a sign of status. If you were knowledgeable, it showed that you either come from a well-educated family or you like to read and study, which shows interest and discipline. If you wanted to learn something, you would have to go to a library or find an encyclopedia, if your family was well off enough to have one. It required time, money, and/or effort, and because it was tied to status, you typically did not just make things up to your friends and acquaintances, because every time you were wrong, it was a hit to your reputation. Double-checking something wasn't easy, so if you realized someone lied to you, you would be suspicious of anything they said moving forward. That's why if someone didn't know something, they would often prefer to not talk at all, rather than risk being ridiculed. Because if your reputation were to take one too many hits, you could then be ousted as the village idiot to your social circle. Quite frankly, I like the way that society valued knowledge before the internet. Sure, there were plenty of charlatans to go around even back then, but for the most part they were quite obvious and usually hidden in a dark corner of obscurity where they belonged. And I say that as someone whose goal was to challenge established academic literature on my subject of interest. Because yes, as an institutional outsider, I was set to contradict long-standing conclusions written by respected Ivy League university professors without having a degree in the relevant field. There's no way that's possible, right? It is possible. Here is the proof. Normally for peer review, the referees receive an anonymous manuscript, so they don't know who they're reviewing. However, even when I applied for a contract to write an academic book, all 4 reviewers were told who I was, a nobody, and the book was still accepted on the merit of the application. Also, in a third paper I've written, currently pending publication, I dispute elements of the works of 50 scholars from all around the world. And this article was welcomed with no resistance, despite what many say about the close-mindedness of the academic community. How did I do it? Well, I spent several years researching the subject without making any claims until I was confident in my knowledge. Then I put my thesis to paper as clearly as I could, and I presented it to a leading peer-reviewed academic journal in the field. You'd think they'd immediately reject this nobody with a paper, but no. It was processed and reviewed in a respectful manner and later published. Now, some of you watching this might know of a few influencers or other media personalities that talk about how impossible it is to challenge academia, as academia is hell-bent on ousting anyone who would dare dispute their unfettered wisdom.
First of all, how dare you?
But that's not how it works. The best way for me to demonstrate the process and options available in pursuing a controversial idea so that it either becomes accepted or rejected by the public or academia is via Plato's Allegory. Imagine you're in a cave, staring at a wall with constantly dancing shadows of various objects. Those around you believe these are not shadows being cast upon the wall and instead see them as reality because that's all they've ever known. But you figured out that these illusions aren't as they appear. You break free from the chains holding you back and venture towards the entrance. There you see a grand flame, in front of which shadowy figures move, fake objects which you instantly recognize as the shadows on the wall. Now you have a choice. Will you make another one of these fake objects and cast its shadow to the masses? Or will you take the long and arduous journey of exiting the cave and exploring what lies beyond? In other words, will you promote an appealing theory that you know is false, but will give you money, fame, and vainglory, or will you take the more difficult route to figure out what's actually true? This requires an immense amount of research and learning, formulating a thesis, writing it out in a clear manner, supporting it with existing evidence, and then providing it to other experts for scrutiny and analysis. It's not just a challenging process. It can be thankless or even futile. And all the while, in the back of your mind, you'll always have the temptation of quitting somewhere along the way. And this more difficult route entails coming to terms with the possibility that your previously held beliefs may be false under the scrutiny of objective reality. It's no wonder why most people will not go through this process unless it's in their line of work. That's also why these influencers will always prefer to just use their charisma and the veneer of a specialist to project easily digestible yet attractive illusions to the general public. But let me stop being vague and give a specific example of such a figure. Graham Hancock. Bear in mind, before I get into this, that I don't agree with certain sections of the SAA's open letter to Netflix, and I don't believe that Graham Hancock is inherently evil or racist or what have you. I will even talk about how I think he can redeem himself and redeem his work after we go over his thesis. And the crux of his thesis is that there existed an advanced global Ice Age civilization that influenced various cultures from Egypt to the Americas.
And it was this ancient apocalypse 12,800 years ago that wiped that from the human memory banks almost completely, not entirely completely because there were survivors.
And that's basically all you need to know. So, how does he support his beliefs?
But can we say there's no evidence for an advanced civilization in what they have studied?
In what they have studied, yes, we can say there's no evidence for an advanced civilization.
Okay, that's not great, but apparently this was taken out of context.
The context for my statement that there's no evidence for an advanced civilization in what they have studied is my immediate follow-up statement.
But that brings us to another issue of what is studied and what is not studied by archaeology.
I find my evidence in what is not studied by archaeology. I don't study what they study. I look in the same directions they do, but my focus is entirely different.
He states that he looks at archaeological findings differently than archaeologists. Whereas archaeologists use science, he looks for patterns that relate to astrology. So we have an advanced civilization that could lift heavy stones with nothing but sound.
I always go back to the ancient Egyptian traditions that speak of priests chanting as these huge blocks were lifted into the air. Were they using some kind of sound effect, some kind of use of sound?
But still believe that pareidolia-influenced star pattern figures were of paramount importance. I could go into great detail on astrology because I've unfortunately researched this subject far more than I should or wanted to, but it's ultimately irrelevant to the matter at hand. Instead, let's take all this speculation as true because even if the etchings were to explicitly state that an advanced global Ice Age civilization existed, which they don't, this would not verify anything because faulty ancient sources exist. What Graham really needs to establish are the hypotheses required to prove his thesis, and these are the civilization's global influence and its advanced for the age technology.
The world was mapped and explored by a global seafaring culture with a level of technology that was at least equivalent to ours at the end of the 18th century during the Ice Age.
What is his core argument regarding the lack of tangible evidence?
We're looking at
Bimini?
less than 5% of the continental shelves that have been studied at all by archaeology. But what I'm saying is that not enough of that 27 million square kilometers has been investigated. Only a tiny fraction has been investigated. And that fraction is not enough to draw the conclusion that we can absolutely say there was no lost civilization. Same goes for the Amazon rainforest. Same goes for the Sahara Desert.
All right, so why not find the evidence that supports your hypotheses before writing books or making a Netflix series? These are what make or break your thesis, and this is what I meant in regards to not putting in the proper work and instead creating an illusory object and casting its shadow. He basically says that archaeologists need to work for him to excavate and explore 20-some million square kilometers to prove or disprove that such a civilization existed. So he's just banking on the fact that whoever is to argue with him needs to prove a negative. Unfortunately for him, there is enough evidence to disprove elements of his hypotheses, which in turn brings his thesis to a collapse. Genetic isolation means it couldn't have been global. Lack of Ice Age crop and animal domestication means they were still hunter-gatherers, which, together with the lack of metallurgy, means the civilization couldn't have been advanced. To address why his inferences about astrology and the Sphinx and the pyramids and whatnot are all irrelevant, let's look at some of the scientific terms that not many know despite using them on a daily basis. In particular, what does thesis and hypothesis actually mean with regard to how a scientific theory is formulated? Think of it like building a structure. First, sturdy foundations that can hold the maximum possible weight are essential and necessary. Then, support beams atop these foundations are needed to provide structural integrity when supporting the load of every floor, connecting and transferring weight to the foundations. Next, after the first floor, we have the roof, under which one can continue to build additional levels, given that each subsequent story is stable and secure. In this analogy, the foundations are the axioms, what one takes for granted. The theory needs to be based on fundamental or demonstrable truths. Then the roof is the thesis, which is the statement or belief that is to be proven. Every floor is held up by the support beams, the hypotheses, a term that literally translates to below the thesis. Keep in mind that both thesis and hypothesis are terms coined by Aristotle on his treatise on logic, specifically in the topics and analytics. The hypotheses are proposals meant to explain how the thesis connects to and is based off the axioms. Hence, they prove if it's true or under what circumstances it can be true. If everything is interconnected well with proper syllogistic consistency, the walls and general building materials, then the structure will continue to grow with every inference, each representing an additional floor, supported by the hypotheses, elevating the thesis. If this metaphorical structure is then sturdy enough to carry predictions, it is classified as a scientific theory. Now, in the case of Graham, the axioms he uses are that there was an ice age and that human civilizations existed within this age, which themselves are based upon many other axioms, but for the sake of simplicity, these assumptions are demonstrably true. The problem is that Graham's hypotheses are entirely false. His thesis therefore lays shattered upon broken pillars, atop of which he keeps tossing more and more unjustified conclusions. And to his audience he says, don't look at this huge demolished mess. Look at these shiny new inferences that I get to add. Inferences like that this civilization associated star patterns in a way similar to astrology, or that survivors of this civilization's collapse instructed other cultures on how to create their monuments and their art, and how these surviving structures have X, Y, and Z properties that remain quote-unquote unexplained by archaeologists. Again, even if these were true, they would then belong in a different thesis with a different explanation of how and why they are true, because Graham's is unsupported. But if this isn't enough for you and you think that the negative still hasn't been proven 100%, let me show you how easy it is to use this rhetorical technique. You see, I too have a theory that back during the Ice Age, there existed a single example of a biological organism that took the form of a humanoid sea turtle, the last of a species that separated from its kind prior to their ultimate extinction, an advanced sentient being that evolved via a series of genetic mutations to operate both in land and sea. With time, this Hellenic learned how to masterfully use its physical structure, its surroundings, and handmade weaponry in order to travel across the Ice Age world and combat prehistoric crime. Open your eyes, people. Do you think any human being could come up with an idea as absurd as the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles all on their own? Of course not. They used hidden knowledge of this unique species to create their series, and the only reason a producer ever agreed to accept this wildly outlandish concept was to prepare you, through popular culture, for the inevitable find of this world-shattering reptilian. Go ahead and ask if there's evidence of a tonfa-wielding humanoid turtle, because the answer is actually a question. Have archaeologists surveyed the entire ocean floor for the remains of these testudines? How about you get back to me when they've searched through every inch of the 361 million square kilometers wherein it might be hiding? Because this marine shellback didn't introduce agriculture, it didn't invent metallurgy, or even spread its DNA. It was happy to just vibe and fight crime. So yes, if you believe in a global Ice Age civilization at this point, you might as well believe in an Ice Age mutant ninja turtle. But all joking aside, Graham Hancock knows he doesn't really understand what he's arguing. He even says that he goes against the norm, because where area scientists in the field go from the known to the unknown, he goes straight to the unknown.
I find my evidence not by going from the known to the unknown, but by abandoning all preconceived notions and diving straight into the unknown.
Which makes absolutely no sense. You have to use knowledge to seek new knowledge. The literal first line of Aristotle's work on logic, the Posterior Analytics, is all teaching and learning that involves reason proceeds from pre-existent knowledge. In other words, nothing of what Graham is saying involves reason of any sort. And he doesn't need to take himself so seriously. He's a charismatic person, I'll give him that, but that's the extent of any brilliance one can attribute to him. He simply has not put in the work, and I mean the actual, honest, proper, coherent research. Not flying and diving here and there, writing out an evidence-backed thesis to be read, analyzed, and scrutinized. And don't point me to his commercial publications. These are written to make money, not to advance our understanding of any given topic. Hence, the footnotes don't need to be factual because the manuscript is not peer-reviewed before approval. Now, as I said, I would also suggest how he can redeem himself, because as it stands, he has to choose which path his legacy will take. Will it be this unscientific gibberish, a path that will lead him to nothing but ridicule, or will he choose the path to redemption? Here are the steps I believe he must take in order to leave behind an honorable legacy. Number 1. Distance himself and condemn the charlatans writing on his coattails that have been harassing legitimate scientists in truly reprehensible manners.
And I do urge people who know my work and follow my work that they should subscribe to your channel.
Number 2. Admit to the public that he was so invested in the idea of his thesis that he ignored the possibility that he could be wrong. He overlooked all opposing evidence, logical or tangible, and this oversight led him to incorrect conclusions that he held on to for far too long. By doing so, he could demonstrate to his audience that it's okay to admit you were proven wrong in the end. The man traveled the world, went on journeys, adventures, sought after a subject that he loved. That's what's important. It wouldn't matter that he's incorrect if he'd acknowledged the fact, instead of attacking hardworking scientists and pushing science denialism. He has the opportunity to show that following your dreams, even if it doesn't pan out as you wanted, can still be a fulfilling endeavor. Win or lose, the attempt itself shows you still accomplished something great. Number 3. Embrace the fact that his work, despite its ultimate infeasibility, did ignite people's interest in legitimate history and archaeology. Celebrate those who branched away from his theory into actual science rather than attack them. Make it so that his goal is now to examine the ideology surrounding the myth of a global Ice Age civilization rather than actually taking the myth literally. Listen, mythology is cool because it doesn't have to be taken as factual. That's the entire point. Use these myths to attract people to pursue a proper education rather than try to steer them away from it. And finally, number 4. Apologize to the archaeologists he and his cronies have attacked, because he should be thankful to the scientist who worked incredibly hard with little pay to excavate sites that he visits and explores and claims to love so much in his shows, something that even he admits.
Indeed, I've stated frequently that without their data, none of my work would have been possible.
And let me make something clear for anyone that believes that archaeologists are all a part of a secret cabal hiding information from you. There are tens of thousands of archaeologists that actively work in the field. You think that some history-shattering information exists out there and they're all in on it? As a friend of mine wisely put it in his signature broken English, if one person knows, no one knows. If 2 people know, it's a secret. If 3 people know, everyone knows.
You get the picture?
How well do you think 30,000 people can hold a secret? Don't be silly. But back to Graham. These 4 steps are the least that he can do to repair his image. It's never too late to seek redemption, and anyone can begin to do so today. We're no longer in the pre-internet age. We're slowly reaching a point where society is dominated by extreme relativism in which each person is creating their own distinct reality. They find others in a similar predicament over the internet and then get together to proselytize even more people. And as their numbers grow, they cause all the more tangible harm. Graham Hancock's theory might seem benign, but he's ultimately pushing an anti-science rhetoric that seeps through more than just archaeology. A rhetoric that is bringing back once nearly eradicated diseases that literally have killed children. Seeking truth via science is a noble endeavor, but you have to be ready to put in the immense amount of time and work it requires. And you also need to be ready to have your beliefs challenged, maybe even proven wrong, because this is all part of the process. And the process is worth it, because there is still much to be discovered. And within nature's unknown lies beauty far greater than anything we can deceptively conjure. Let me make it clear that I do have my fair share of grievances against academia, especially when it comes to the monetary side. I was contracted to write a book, but due to lack of funds, due to lack of grants, I am now unable to make it a reality. I may not be able to write this book in the end, but I can still keep the channel alive with your help. You can do so by visiting my digital shop on Ko-Fi or subscribing on Patreon, where I have new presentations uploaded every month. Cheers, everyone.